Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the North Carolina Botanical Garden. Excited to see a big crowd here today, and we have a big crowd online with us as well. I'm Joanna Massey-Lalikas. I'm the Director of Learning and Community Engagement here at the Garden. And with me today, co-moderating, is David Michaud. He is supporting our folks in our Zoom audience today, and will moderate their questions to our speaker later on. Let's see, we have folks joining us today, registered from across the Southeast, across North Carolina as well. And we also have some folks from Maryland, Minnesota, and Illinois. So thank you for everybody who's joining us online. And I think that's all of my notes of things to remind you of. We got a couple other folks joining us right now. So without further ado, I'd really like to take a moment to introduce our special guest today, who's Matt Jones from right down the road in Chatham County. And I've had the pleasure of knowing Matt for, we were just talking about it, almost 10 years now. I used to work with Extension at NC State, and Matt came on there in about 2015, and it was great to get to know him then. And so it's a great opportunity to be able to work with him here at this lecture, and he's also teaching a class with us here and there. So it's wonderful to have him kind of on our education team, if you will, with the garden. So Matt has been a horticulture extension agent with NC State University, as I said, since 2015, and at the Chatham County Center since 2018. He offers education and outreach programs for home gardeners, ornamental nurseries, and landscape professionals, and is the coordinator for the Extension Master Gardener program in Chatham County. And I know he's had a really busy fall season this year, so really grateful also for him to take a break from that and come here today. So please join me in welcoming Matt Jones.
Thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I like to joke I'm sort of a recovering botanist, so I do a lot of horticulture stuff now, but was trained in some botany originally, and it's always fun to be able to do more botanically related things with the Botanic Garden. So I really appreciate the welcome and the opportunity. But as part of my current position in Extension, we are essentially the public outreach arm of the land-grant universities in each state. So even though I have a cool name of agent, it's not a secret agent, unfortunately. But we act essentially as educators, field faculty in different county centers across the state. And there's also, of course, gardener volunteers who help greatly expand our program, several of which are in the audience. You're surrounded, possibly. And it also includes researchers on campus. So there are professors that specialize in applied research related to agriculture and related topics. So it is a chance for the university to help translate and communicate some of that research-based information to the broader public. And that is sort of what I'm doing today, I hope, is that I'm going to provide a big picture overview of the ferns, like 101. I'm not a teratologist, so I'm not a specialist in ferns, and I'm not a community ecologist, but I hope that as an extension educator, I can help translate a lot of this and provide you a good overview of orienting yourself among the types of ferns. And also, I'm going to highlight some of my favorite ones for a garden context. But to orient yourself to the broader plant groups, let's just remind ourselves of a typical phylogenetic tree of the plant kingdom. Some of this is a little bit out of date. There's been some movement among the finer branches, but essentially all the modern land plants evolved from a green algal ancestor, and the land plants themselves have several features that allow them to be adapted to living in a terrestrial environment, at least originally. Within that group, there are kind of four major groups. The mosses and their friends, so the mosses, the liverworts, and the hornworts. Those are the non-vascular plants. They don't have vessels specialized for transporting food and water, so that limits their size. And then then the ferns is the next group highlighted in green here. Those include, as we'll see, the lycophytes in the broad sense, the ferns and their allies, the relative. The lycophytes, the horsetails, and various different fern groups, which we'll address briefly today. And these are vascular plants, so they do have those specialized vessels that allow them to get much taller. And indeed, there are still tree-like ferns today, and there were much larger tree-like ferns in the distant past. And then what makes them different, though, than the succeeding groups of plants, the conifers, the gymnosperms in yellow, and the angiosperms, the flowering plants in red, is that instead of dispersing their offspring by seed or by fruits in seed, and instead of having flowers, they have spores. And they also have, as we'll see momentarily, swimming sperm. Plants can swim. And that makes them, that's a very different mode of reproduction and a mode of gene dispersal in the environment. So focusing on that for a second, just to make that clear, because there are different ways to spread advantageous genes in a population, right? You can disperse your gametes, or you can disperse your offspring. And these different groups of plants do this in different ways. So in terms of dispersing the gametes, in this case we mean sperm cells, the mosses and the ferns, in the broad sense, actually have swimming sperms. They need, at one certain phase of their life cycle, a film of water for the sperm to swim in and reach the egg of hopefully a non-relative. And then the seed plants, which include the conifers, the cycads, ginkgo, and then also all the flowering plants, instead of having swimming sperm, they have pollen. And pollen grains are tiny male plants that can contain or do contain sperm cells. And pollen is typically distributed by wind in the case of a lot of the conifers, or as we know with angiosperms, often by animal pollinators. Then the offspring of the ferns and mosses is also different than what may be more familiar to you with the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Instead of having seeds, or instead of having seeds enveloped in a fruit wall that are large, multicellular, et cetera, they release spores, and spores are single cells of dispersal. So while spores of ferns and mosses, but we'll focus on ferns, while spores of ferns can disperse some distance from the parent, you can imagine that once that spore germinates, becomes the gametophyte, which you'll learn about later, where the sperm and egg are dispersed from, there's only so far a swimming sperm can go. So that has sort of interesting implications for the ecology and dispersal of ferns and also mosses in that case. So with that in mind, let's look at, before I go in, the course of action today is going to be, I'll give you an overview of the major groups of ferns, including some of their relatives, and then we'll focus more on the group of ferns that most of us recognize as ferns, the polypodidae ferns, also called the leptosporangiate ferns, or the phyllocales, and then use that as an example to really understand their anatomy and morphology a bit more. So we'll go into more detail about their anatomy and morphology, and then I'll quickly kind of go through some characters to think about after we go through the basics, some variation in characters that are helpful for identification, and then we'll go look at some tools for identification, and then spend the last 10, 15 minutes or so talking about ferns in the garden with a little bit, very, very tiny bit on propagation, and then my 7 or 8 favorite species. I don't have time for questions. So of the major groups of ferns, and fern alloys we'll call them, I have yet to find a nice, small, up-to-date tree. So I had to make my own, so that's why it's hideous, and I apologize. But this is meant to display the major fern groups. Pretend actually below the lycophytes, that would be the mosses, right? But we're going to look at briefly the lycophytes, which are the club mosses, which aren't mosses, the spike mosses, which also are not mosses, and then the isodes, or the quillworts. And then those are considerably more primitive, if we want to use that word in a colloquial way, than the rest of that tree. So the next taxa above that, or lineage above that, are the horsetails, which many of you are familiar with, also the scouring rushes. Those are also very fern-like in a lot of their morphology and anatomy. And then there are several groups that are a little bit weird. We got the ophioglossid ferns, which include adder's tongue fern, and then a very strange one called the whisk ferns. And those look primitive but aren't really, as we'll see in a second. And then basal to the morphological, isn't that fun to say? Are the muratoid ferns, and we don't have any of those in the southeast, but they do kind of represent morphologically a lot of similarities to the polypodidae, which are the ferns we most recognize probably. So within the lycophytes, they are a lineage that diverged a long time ago from the other fern allies. They are vascular plants, so they do have phloem and xylem, but instead of having true leaves, which have veins that are networked or netted, they have what are called microphylls, so tiny leaves that just have a single vascular trace, so that limits the size of the leaf. But they do have concentrations at their tips. You can see on this Redding cedar at the far left, also not a cedar, so this is why Latin names are important. That structure at the top, on the leftward photo on the top of that plant is where the spores are released from. They're called strobili, sort of cone-like structures. And Redding cedar is probably the most common one you might come across. It's kind of cool to see. Others include foxtail club moss, which is more frequently found in the coastal plain, as is common ground pine. And you can guess, yes, that's not a real pine. Along with some of these other lycopods, as we'll see, some of these other groups rather, there were ancestors to these groups that were quite large. All of this evolution, many of these lineages rather, were diverging probably in the Devonian, I think, and it really had split apart by the Carboniferous. And some of these have ancestors that made up the kind of sort of cool tropical swampy forests that eventually, after fossilization and geological processes, became what we call coal. So that was a one-time event that we've now mostly turned into the atmosphere, right? And now another group of lycophytes are the spike mosses, or the Selaginaceae. These include the many selaginella houseplants. A lot of these are more tropical in distribution. And it also includes the resurrection plants, not to be confused with resurrection fern, but this is a species from the western part of the country that it can dry out quite considerably and still, when water is applied, reconstitute itself. And they're mostly similar in structure to the club mosses, but they have an extra ligule by their small leaves, and their gametophytes, as we'll see, are unisexual instead of bisexual. A really weird one are the quillworts, Isotaceae, and these really are among the big players that were big players in the tree-like lycophytes of the Carboniferous, but they are now mostly found in permanent water bodies that have some sort of moving water, but you can see they're pretty highly reduced. They have these kind of thin leaves that are immersed in the water and flow in the water, and then the spore-producing parts of the plant are kind of at the base of these leaves. So kind of an odd little outlier here. But we do have these in North Carolina. Most of what I'll show you today, we do occur to some extent. I meant to add, I have little maps from FloraQuest or from Weekly's Flora on many of these species to sort of show the distribution, so I hope you brought your binoculars. But I can share the PDF if you want. But that's just to give you an idea of where they're distributed in the southeast and what physiographic regions in the state they're in. Okay, moving out of the lycophytes now into the closer relatives of the true ferns. We'll start with the horsetails, or these are the scouring rushes. And many of you have probably seen them before, and they're really cool to have. They get a little happy, so if you do plant these in the garden, make sure they're contained to some degree. But they don't have, their leaves have been reduced to almost nothing. And so anytime you see a node or a notch, those little kind of black-brown dry parts, those are what's left functionally of the leaves, and it does photosynthesize primarily in the stem. There are some that have just one kind of stem that is fertile. Others, though, like the one in the graphic on the left, can produce both sterile and fertile stems. And the cone-like structures, the strobili, that release the spores are on the top. So that kind of expanded cone structure is where the spores are released from. And we got three to four species here in North Carolina. Now on to another basal family of ferns, are the ophioglossid ferns. This is primarily the adder's tongue family. So we do have true adder's tongue, and this is kind of fun because it produces basically one leaf per year. Part of it is vegetative and is for photosynthesis, and the other part of it produces the spore-releasing structures, for the sporangia. And then more commonly, though, is the rattlesnake fern. It looks more fern-like, but it is in this family. But likewise, it has kind of one triangular, in a broad sense, shaped vegetative, sterile leaf, and then another part of that leaf, another leaf is release of spores, that kind of curled yellow structure at the top. My favorite of the weird ones, though, is this guy, the Psilotaceae, Psilotum. There's, I think, several species of Psilotum. These have seemingly really primitive features. So they have dichotomous branching. So every time when there's a split, it's just a simple Y split, and that Y split splits again. And there's no leaves, and there's even hardly any roots. They have like rhizoid-like structures that have an association with fungi that allow them to take in nutrients and water. So it looked suspiciously similar for a long time to an ancestral vascular plant called the rhinophytes, the rhinophyta. It had, and look, it's dichotomous branching, and sorry, lower center right. It had the sporangia at the tips, so it was once thought this might have been one of the basal fern lineages, the primitive lineages. But more evidence. Now we have genetic evidence. It's just a really streamlined fern. It's like fern life has been too complicated. Let's go back to the basics. Leaves too much. Also roots too much. So that's all this is. In our area, these are primarily in the coastal plain here. Usually they're kind of more epiphytic, or at least growing on like stumps or rocks and that sort of thing. But they can be seen, but it's not especially common. And then a group of ferns that does not occur in North Carolina are the Maradiales. This is kind of a basal lineage of the true ferns, we're thinking that way. And they're found in different paleotropic regions, so like Australasia and Madagascar, and there's another genus that's, I think, exclusive to Hawaii. And these produce some of the biggest fronds in the ferns, though, huge fronds. And some of them have tree-like forms. And they're not, it's not true wood, it's not true trunk, secondary growth like you would see in gymnosperms or angiosperms, but they can get rather tall and kind of woody in the loose sense of the term. And I'm also not going to mention another family, the Cyatheaceae, which I think is in the polypod broader group, but those are the other group of ferns that still produce kind of tree-like forms in some regions. I think both Neotropic and Paleotropic. Okay, on to the real things, the real ferns here, more or less. So we've covered the basal ferns like the lycophytes. Now these are what, again, most non-botanists recognize as ferns. In the literature, you might see this group called the Phyllocales, or the leptosporangiate ferns, and that has to do with how their sporangia develop. But the pteridophyte phylogeny group, which is the group of scientists working on understanding the relationships among the ferns, is calling this broader group the Polypodiidae, which is much more fun to say than leptosporangiate. And so the next 12 or so taxa or orders and families we'll go over are all in this broader group. And most of them look rather fern-like, but there are some weird exceptions that we'll see here. I had to start with the Osmundaceae. This is the royal fern family. It's cinnamon fern. Cinnamon fern is the best fern, obviously. So they're known for having really large, kind of coarse leaves and dimorphic fronds too. So some of the leaves, some of the fronds are photosynthetic, the others just produce spores. And then the others on this group, like the filmy ferns, are interesting. They have extremely thin fronds, and they're basically attached to rocks near waterfalls. They have to almost constantly remain wet to survive. And some other interesting ones are like curly grass ferns or climbing ferns. This is Lygodium. That's the one, the third from the left. It's more vine-like in its growth form. Then there are some aquatic ferns too, like the well-known mosquito fern, Azolla caroliniana on the far right. This is what you might see floating in ponds if it turns red occasionally, not to be confused with like duckweed or water mule, but there are some small floating plants, and sometimes those are ferns. And it's also the same group that giant salvinia is in, that really nasty invasive floating fern species. So this diversity in form is one of the first questions you get asked if you're playing with some keys, especially the FloraQuest or Dr. Weekly's key. Is it clinging to a rock outcrop and thin and constantly wet? Is it a vine? Is it floating in water? If not, check those off. You can go deeper into the dichotomous key, for example. More typical ferns include things like the Pterodaceae. That's the family that includes maidenhair ferns primarily. And there's lots of work that needs to be done in that family systematically. They're very kind of morphologically diverse, but that also includes the brake ferns, if you've heard of those. Not to be confused with the bracken ferns, the Dentstatiaceae. Those also are rather morphologically diverse, lots of variations in the pattern of the spores and how their fronds are divided, et cetera. And there are two of those, two bracken ferns in North Carolina, one of which is the hay-scented fern, which you might have heard of. The Aspleniaceae, or the spleenworts, are a single genus and 13 different species of Aspleniaceae. You might be more familiar with a spleenwort that has a simple leaf, so it's not subdivided. There's not any of those that are native here. All of our spleenworts have subdivided fronds. And then the lady ferns on the far right are another family in themselves. Another very morphologically diverse group, 2 genera, 5 species in North Carolina. And not native, but maybe familiar, is the Japanese painted fern, is also in the Aetheriaceae. So that helps some. Then finally on our family tour, the Pterodaceae are the wood ferns and the holly ferns. And a fern that you're probably most familiar with in that group is the Christmas fern, Lyscum acrosticoides, which we'll talk more about later. And it also includes holly ferns. Another example that's not native but still maybe familiar is the Japanese holly fern, I think, Cryptomium. And then the polypod ferns are another diverse group, mostly called rock-cap ferns, 4 species. And that is inclusive of the true resurrection fern, which can survive some period of drought. Then finally, the 2 on the right are really closely related. They're sister groups, the Naucleaceae and the Blechinaceae. That's a fun one to say too. The sensitive ferns and deer ferns. And both of them tend to favor really wet conditions, and both tend to have kind of, again, coarsely divided pinnatifid fronds, rather, which we'll learn about in just a few slides. So that's the big picture tour of the major groups of ferns. And I want to use these groups of ferns, the Polypodiales and Polypoideae, as a model for giving you examples of basic fern morphology. So we'll start there. So the ferns, the gross anatomy includes the leaves, which we tend to call fronds. The fronds are attached to typically horizontal stems called rhizomes. And off the rhizomes grow roots. And the roots tend to be rather small. They don't tend to have, I don't know of any of them having secondary growth. They tend to be kind of finer roots. And this main adult form, if we can call it that, the large ferns we see are part of the life cycle called the sporophyte. The spore meaning spore, phyte meaning plant. It's the phase of the life cycle that produces spores. The rhizomes themselves, the stems, can vary quite a bit, and sometimes that can be helpful for identification. So sometimes the stems behave more in a stoloniferous pattern, even so they're still stems, but they tend to grow kind of right at the surface. Sometimes the more rhizotomous, so horizontal stem that's at or below the soil line, if it's a terrestrial fern. And then some ferns have really thick and fleshy rhizomes, others they're rather thin, wiry. And there's sometimes a difference in the spacing between the fronds along the rhizome. So in a lot of the literature, it's called, they're referred to as short creeping or long creeping. I guess I'd rather have a short creep around than a long creep. And that, if they're really creeping and aggressively creeping, that can be an indicator of if it's a, so say, take that back. A long creeping fern is more likely to be a spreader than perhaps a short creeping fern would be, like a clumping fern. So the fronds themselves are, the leaves themselves are referred to as fronds, and they unfurl from a fiddlehead. So just the way that leaves are folded in the buds as they develop is called vernation. That's an important character in grass identification in some cases too. And there's different kinds of vernations, but the particular type of vernation that produces a fiddlehead is called cercinate vernation. The frond itself is comprised of several parts. There's the blade, kind of like in a leaf. We have truly a typical, like angiosperm leaf, we have a blade. And there's also a petiole. And then in fern land, it's often called a stipe, because we can't use, why call it a petiole? We can call it something else. So the stipe or petiole goes into the leaf blade, and at that point it becomes the rachis, similar to a midrib on say, an angiosperm leaf. Then frequently first, the shape of the blade can sometimes be helpful for identification too. So when you look at the shape of the entire frond, you're looking at the outline of the shape. So sometimes if you're asked about that in an identification tool, don't look at the tiniest segments, look at the overall leaf shape if they refer to that. But frequently, the blade is subdivided into smaller segments. The first level of the segment is called a pinna, plural pinny, and that comes from the Latin word for feather, which makes some sense, right? And then, depending on how many times it's divided, the subdivisions of the pinny can be called a secondary pinny or tertiary pinny. And then there's a final segment, if they are subdivided, whatever that segment is, that's called a pinnule, so a tiny pinny. Whenever the midrib is going through a pinny, we don't call it a rachis, we call it a costa. And when it's going through a pinnule, it's called a costule. This is why I'm in botany. I can learn all these silly terms. So here's the close-up of a frond that is subdivided into pinnules, just to show you can see that. And one thing to start looking at when we look at a few additional leaves is when they are subdivided, how connected is the leaf blade tissue to other leaf blade tissues. So sometimes they are connected and continuous, and other times they're distinct and separate from each other. So if there is no dramatic segmentation, the frond is described as a simple frond or simple leaf. Here is Anasplenium that sort of has it that's native, but it's not quite as clearly simple as some other Asplenium. But you can see they may have some teeth on the margins. There may be some slight lobations, but not as deep as we'll see on the next level of subdivision, which are pinnatophyid fronds. And maybe to understand pinnatophyid, let's compare pinnatophyid to the next level, pinnate, and understand them collectively. So with a pinnate frond, the leaf segments are completely separated from each other. So on the far right is Christmas fern, and if you look at Christmas fern, you will find that each little leaflet-like structure is not connected to neighboring leaflet-like structures. In the case of pinnatophyid fronds, however, there is a continuation of the leaf tissue from segment to segment or from leaflet to leaflet. So if you can tell on the pinnatifid, on the Anoclea, the sensitive fern, there is a there is a continuation of that leaf tissue from each segment. And that can vary along the frond sometimes. So sometimes it looks more connected at the tip and less so at the base or vice versa. But in an identification context, you're looking for what is most typical for that frond. It gets better, though. You can subdivide this several times over, as I mentioned. So in addition to having just good old-fashioned pinnatifid like Anoclea, you can do that twice over. You can do it 3 times over. So they're called bipinnatifid, tripinnatifid. And again, the first segmentation is called a pinna, unless it is the last segmentation. And everything in between is called primary, secondary, tertiary, et cetera. And then that final segment is called an ultimate segment or a pinnule. But you can also have both at the same time. And so sometimes ferns will be described as being pinnate pinnatifid. So the first level of segmentation is, say, free from tissue connection. So you'll see on this cinnamon fern here that if you look where the person's thumb is and go down that rachis, and then look directly to the larger segments that are branching off of that rachis, those are clearly separated from each other, right? But on the individual pinnae, the pinnules are mostly connected to each other. So that's why it is pinnate and then pinnatifid. And then in other cases, you might find some other descriptions of some things are triangular or trilobed, like with Batrachium, one of the, or Batrachus, I forgot what the latest name is, the Rousing fern. So as a little quiz here, so what does this Pegopterus look like, this northern beach fern look like to you? These tend to be found pretty much just around waterfalls near highlands, I think. Would you call that pinnatifid, pinnate, bipinnatifid, bipinnate? Just shout it out. Uh-oh.
Pinnate. Yeah.
Bipinnatifid, yes. So you'll notice that the largest segments are connected to each other on the costa, but as well as the smaller pinnules on each of the pinnae are connected to each other. So I would probably call that bipinnatifid. It's more evident as you go further down to me, more evident to me if you go further down the frond. How about this hot mess? This is lowland bladder fern. This mostly is in the mountains again, some in the Piedmont. I would call the first level pinnate, and then the second level pinnatifid. Would we agree? So if you look, I've got my pointer, sorry. If you look on that arching segment on the rightmost quarter of the picture, that's the main rachis. And then coming off of that is the secondary, is the pinnae, and those pinnae are further subdivided into pinnules, and those are connected to each other. So we would probably call that pinnate pinnatifid. And notice you start to see on the underside of that leaf little brown spots. Don't worry, that's not a fungus, that's not an infection. Those are the reproductive structures of ferns, or rather the spore-releasing structures. And those are only found on the first of 2 phases of the fern life cycle. So it's a 2-phase life cycle: a sporophyte, a spore-producing plant, and a gametophyte, a gamete-producing plant. One is quite large and conspicuous. The gametophyte, though, is very small indeed. The sporophyte releases spores. So on the leaf, there are structures that we'll look at next that produce spores. They undergo meiosis, and they release these single-celled structures that are haploid. And those get dispersed away from the parent plant. Those spores then germinate into this gametophyte phase. And it's the gametophyte that does the sexy stuff, okay, the naughty stuff. And in the case of most of these ferns, most of these gametophytes are bisexual. So they have both sperm-producing and egg-producing structures on them. They're small, usually heart-shaped. They're called prothali, and they need to be in rather moist conditions because, as we'll see, the sperm need to swim. So there has to be some sort of film with water for reproduction to occur. So looking first at the sporophytes in more detail, the spores are released from structures on the underside of leaves of fronds called sporangia. And those sporangia are clustered into larger structures called sori, S-O-R-I, singular sorus, S-O-R-U-S. And the shape of the sori, the color, the structure can be helpful for identification. Sometimes that sorus is covered with another layer of tissue as it matures, and that's called an indusium. So the presence or absence of that indusium can also be helpful for identification. But in these sori are the sporangia, and each sporangia consists of structures like you see on the top right of the screen. And those sporangia have a jacket or a jacket of cells, a single layer of cells around them. Two types. There's the annulus and the I forgot the other term. Anyway, there's the part that opens and the stomium, like stoma, like you would see on a fig. Anyway, the way that that outer jacket is structured is that when it dries out, it will actually open up and fling the spores from inside the sporangia out away from the parent plant. And you can see the cross section on the lower right there of a single sorus. And in this case, the indusium is covering the top of the sporangia until they mature. And on the far lower right is an example of a fern spore. And they can vary in shape. They're like dust, though. You have to use a microscope to see their structure, but there can be variations in their morphology depending on the group they belong to.
Does that explain why they're on the bottom?
Yeah, so that does. So the question was, does that explain why they're on the bottom of the leaves? Yeah, so that probably aids in dispersal away from the parent plant. Yeah. So the location of the sori, their shape, their color, whether or not they have indusia on them, all of those are critical for identifying ferns. So they could be round in shape, they can be elongate, they can cover the entire bottom of a pinna, they can just be on the margins, the very edges. Sometimes they're along the veins. Sometimes they're brown, sometimes they're yellow, sometimes even kind of greenish. And on the far right is from maidenhair fern. And they have some the sori on the margins of the leaves, and they even have something called a false indusium. So instead of a true indusium, authentic 100% USDA grade A indusia, they have a false one where the leaf kind of rolls over the sporangia. And so the presence or absence of those indusia and the type of indusia can also be helpful. So once the spores are released from the sporophyte, the spores will germinate and grow into gametophyte. Oh, look, it loves you. It's the gametophyte is just a tiny, relatively flat, maybe like thumbnail, half inch size, not inch, half inch. I've got tiny hands. Plant that really needs moist environments to thrive. And it is physiologically independent of the parent, obviously, but genetically shares genes, of course. And the gametophyte itself is, because it's specialized for sexual reproduction, has, in the case of these ferns, both egg-producing and sperm-producing structures on the underside of the thallus structure. So typically, the archegonia, the egg-containing structures, are kind of in the cleft of the heart, and then the antheridia are interspersed throughout the rest of the bottom of the gametophyte. Fern sperm are pretty ferocious looking. This is actually from Equisetum, I think, but they are pretty large, and they have multiple flagella, so they can power through some distance, but not a huge distance. And most of the bisexual ferns tend to have some degree of self-incompatibility, so they can avoid selfing each other, because the whole point of sex is to encourage outcrossing. Um, so often they'll swim to some other neighbor. Hopefully it has a different, different ancestry. And once the sperm finds the archegonia, it swims in the archegonia, finds the egg, fertilizes the egg, and that zygote then will grow into a new sporophyte, and eventually that gametophyte just withers away. So all of the sporophytes you see ultimately arose from a gametophyte that was fertilized in this manner. Who knew that, right? Now, on to some identification tools for ferns. So now that we know the basics of what to look for, how do we make use of that information? Well, the most direct way, if you want to be a hardcore cool botanist, is to use the flora of the southern and mid-Atlantic states in our case. This is what Dr. Weekly and the Herbarium and Botanic Garden have been working on revising for a long time. It is authoritative. It is fabulous. The classic floras you typically see, like Radford or something, are going to be these big honking books, and this is the version of the flora that I assume will be published as a book eventually, but right now is available as a PDF. So it's great. It's authoritative, the latest in systematics and correct names. And since Dr. Weekly is a vegetation ecologist, a very amazing information or community ecologist, on where these grow in the Southeast, and very specific descriptions of their habitats, distributions, et cetera. Now, a 1,078-page PDF can be a little bit cumbersome. So instead, though, this whole data, all this information is actually available in an app form. And I must say, it is a really cool app. So FloraQuest is what it's called. There's a company that helped turn the flora into a really useful app. This is not a take a picture app like Picture This or something. It's not an AI app or anything, but it is an excellent, an incredible interpretation of flora in a much more compact form. And you can, I've been like kind of blown away at how well it works and how cool it is. I hope every flora in the world gets turned into some version of this because of its ease of use, of its ability, the way you can integrate photographs, you can integrate range information, all of that in a really elegant way. Within the app version, and there is an online URL website version too, but within the app version, there are kind of two modes that you can use to identify any plant in this region. There are graphical keys. So if you select that mode, you're given some photos and some descriptions of like, what are you seeing? And then that will take you to another menu that will, depending on what group of plants you've chosen, another menu that will allow you to choose information like habitat and sunlight exposure, and then different morphological features to help you narrow down what you could be looking at. So in that sense, in my view, it sort of acts more like a wildlife book. You know, if you know some basic details, you can narrow down the possibilities and kind of flip through what it could be. And then it will ultimately take you to the entry on that plant that is identical that you would find in the printed flora and in the dichotomous key. And in that entry, which you can also get online at FloraQuest.org, you'll get photos, descriptions of the family, descriptions of the genus, the distribution patterns, some history if needed, especially on the history of how they were classified and what the controversies are on the circumspection of that group, et cetera. So that's a kind of a fun way to introduce yourself into using keys. But if you're a fuddy-duddy Luddite like myself, then there are typical normal dichotomous keys integrated as well. So here, you can interact with the key instead of having to flip through a 1,000-page book or PDF. So if you happen to know what you're looking at, you can kind of skip ahead. Like if you know you're looking at a fern, there's no reason to key your way out of the gymnosperms or something. So you can click on, say, lycophytes and pteridophytes, and that's when the key will begin. And it provides you two sets of statements, two descriptions, and then you look at your sample and decide which of those descriptions is the better descriptor. And then based on that, you will hit the orange button, and that will give you the next step in the key. And that continues until you get to that same entry, that same data point as you would with a graphical key. So some tips on using FloraQuest or for ferns especially. The types of questions you'll be asked are the habitat. Are you seeing, is it a terrestrial fern? Is it growing in the soil? Or is it an epiphytic fern? Is it growing on other plants? Or is it growing on, say, rock formations or tree stumps or something? Or is it aquatic? So that's an easy thing to eliminate, all right? And then, because as we mentioned, there are some ferns that look very unfern-like, you know, the filmy ferns or the Lygodium, the kind of viney ferns or the aquatic ferns. And then it's going to ask you about its relative size or absolute size, like is it a small, tiny thing, or is it, you know, relatively large? Then it will ask you about the overall leaf shape, and then how the leaf is divided. Is it pinnate, pinnatifid, pinnate, pinnatifid, etc. Then there's, sorry, I'm making them short. As with flowering plants, you also need to look at the margins of the leaves. Are the individual pinny lobed? Are they toothed? Etc. What are the venation patterns? Ferns, I didn't cover this today, but ferns have like 3 or 4 types of venation patterns, and that can also be helpful for ID. And then look on the underside if it's the right time of year. If it's in spring, especially, look at the pattern of the sporangia. And then in some cases, as I mentioned earlier, the arrangement or the density of the fronds along the rhizome can be helpful. Now, another tool, because it has been around for a few years and it's useful in instruction, is another easy-to-access key, are the sets of online keys that Dr. Krings developed. So Dr. Krings is the director of the NC State Herbarium, and he's got a website called The Botanist's Little Helper. Isn't that cool? And there's web browser-based keys for ferns, for trees of the Piedmont, like common trees, for winter tree ID. It's what I use for those classes. So these are really easy to use too. In the case of the ferns, it's actually not a dichotomous key. It's more of a linear key. So it will give you 3 or 4 options. Pick one of those 4, go to the next 3 or 4 options, and look at some photos. So that's another kind of cool tool to use. All right, as we start to wrap up here, I got a few more minutes left. These species, I think, ferns as a taxa, rather, a group of plants, are rather underappreciated, I think, in the garden. We should be doing more of these. In the Piedmont, it's a little harder. Charlotte Glenn had this revelation, or she explained this to me, and I was like, of course. But in the Piedmont, a lot of our shadier sites tend to be drier too, like a lot of drier forest. But so we don't have as many of diversity of ferns as you might find in the mountains or in the coastal plain. But there are still a number of species that will do fine in especially moisture soils in Piedmont gardens. So most ferns tend to favor moister sites, tend to favor part shade to shadier sites. A lot of them, once established, will tolerate sun if there's sufficient moisture, of course. But it's a great option for ground covers. They can provide benefits to wildlife as habitat and cover, and some of them are actually larval hosts as well. In a gardening context, there are some that are evergreen, some that are deciduous, so you can choose accordingly if you want some winter green color. There are some few outstanding examples. Some of them are clumping, so they're relatively well behaved. Others are a little bit aggressive and can be rather spready. But in some woodland type habitats or gardens, that can be a real advantage. Maybe especially if you're trying to combat like Japanese tiltgrass or something. And good news for us too, in this part of the state, well, the whole state, they are quite deer resistant. So show Bambi what you can do here. So lots of advantages to try them out. They're not as easy to find in the trade as you might. Of the native plant nurseries in Chatham County, for example, I don't think any of them have ferns, but you can certainly, I would think at plant sales, get them here. Carolina Native in Burnsville has a broad selection, and some of you may know some other examples too. Propagation, there's a lot that we can talk about here, but I would recommend really refer you to the Fern Growers Manual. So Barbajo Hoshizaki was a really well-known specialist in ferns and fern propagation and horticulture, I think from Southern California. And so she's got a whole book that's been updated several times since she passed away. But the takeaway would be a lot of ferns can be divided pretty easily. As long as you've got some roots and part of some fronds left, they can be divided pretty easily. Now, some of the bigger ones we'll look at in a second, you may need a chainsaw, but they theoretically can be divided. Now, if you're getting really nerdy, you can try to grow your own gametophytes too. Now, this is essentially, you're essentially going to collect the spores, rest a frond on a white sheet of paper, let the spores fall off, carefully collect them, and like, don't breathe. And then in a moist media of like peat moss and sand, usually they're traditionally done in like a clear container. I've seen some greenhouse people grow them in like glass casserole dishes with a glass lid, or like plate glass. But you're going to essentially sprinkle them on that moist media, cover it, don't water it. It'll stay moist enough until the phalli germinate and grow. So you'll get this mat of gametophytes. And you got to, and they'll typically grow in like 2 weeks. And then you got to wait a few months while they do their thing with the sperm and egg. And then eventually you'll start to see new sporophytes emerge, and you can thin them out and divide them that way. So wrapping up, my few favorite ferns, and then I'll open up to questions the remaining few minutes. I don't know why I like this one so much. I have a thing for it. It's a personal problem maybe, but I think I either saw it here or at Green Swamp. And it's this big, elegant coastal plain, mostly coastal plain species called cinnamon fern. And it has dimorphic fronds, so really large vegetative fronds. And the cinnamon, I think, comes from the name of the fact that the fertile fronds that just have spores look sort of like cinnamon sticks, but there's also lots of like tan hairs on the ragas and stuff. They are clumping. They are deciduous, kind of light green, coarse texture. Tend to favor like precosins or wet savannas naturally. But they can be found in some basic sites with, occasionally wetter soils. Larry Mellechamp's book on native plants is excellent. And his description of this, one of the words was that it's impossible to overwater it. So it can really get big and a little bit aggressive, or at least it can overshadow other neighboring plants, so be careful there. It does have nice fall color too before it dehisces or goes into dormancy. And a relative, of course, that's probably the really common or relatively common, easy to find, is royal fern. Many of the same characters. It grows naturally in again, wetter sites, moist forests, etc. Coarser texture with the larger pinny. Then Christmas fern is probably the most recognizable and maybe most common in our area. It is evergreen in winter, so that's part of the reason by the name. But the pinny also are sort of shaped like Christmas stockings, so that's kind of where the name comes from. This one is probably the most tolerant of the most conditions: sun, shade, wet, dry. Really fill it out. Look at that. Do you see any microstegium there? It's amazing. Another good one is hay-scented fern. In theory, in practice, it's not quite as good. It looks great, really fine texture, yellow-green in color, and it smells like fresh cut hay when you rub the glands. But Mellechamp reports that it's kind of tricky to grow. In his book, he mentioned that he's tried to grow it at the UNC Charlotte Botanical Garden for years and was not successful. But it is in the trade. You can get it at, say, some nurseries. Sensitive fern, okay, it's aggressive as heck. It will cover everything, but I've got a soft spot for it. So if you've got a wet site that you don't know what else to do with, let this go. It'll be fabulous. And several wood ferns are available. There's Dryopteris exostralis, which is Dixie wood fern. I'll shut up in a second. Sorry, guys. It was a natural hybrid found in South Carolina. And actually, the Botanical Garden helped introduce us to the trade in the 80s. So it's got a lot of cool features, one of which it's erect much of the year. And as winter approaches, it kind of just droops down and serves like a ground cover. Less easy, not as probably garden compliant, but still really elegant if you got the right conditions. Moisture-wise is evergreen wood fern. It's got like that, Jurassic charisma to it on the right there. And then the maidenhair ferns, of course, got to have some of these. We're probably more familiar with southern maidenhair. I was not familiar with northern maidenhair until I moved here and came here, actually. And everyone's got to have northern maidenhair. Just get some if you got a shady site. Smaller leaves, finer textured, black stipes, which are kind of interesting, contrasting, and tolerant of some part sun, kind of like morning sun. All right, with that, we got a few minutes remaining, I hope, for questions. That was a lot, but I hope that was all right.
Great. Thanks so
Thank
much,
you,
Matt. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we'll start with a question from an online audience. If you have questions here in the room, feel free to raise your hand, and Joanna will bring the microphone over. This first question that came through, you did confirm that ferns can be planted where Japanese stiltgrass has been removed. What would you recommend as far as ferns for Piedmont woods? You mentioned the Christmas fern,
Yeah,
but any others?
Yeah, Christmas fern would probably be my main choice. You can probably get away with Dixie wood fern too. Yeah. Yeah.
Advice for planting southern maidenhair ferns. I manage to kill them no matter what I do.
The conditions seem right, or when are you planting them? It kind of depends on what you're doing. I mean, try to plant them in the fall. Make sure they're well watered and well established. They do prefer more shade than northern maidenhair does. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the major tips that I can think of. I don't know if you find it failing quickly after planting or just declining the following season.
Declining right in. I buy them and they die. They have fronds that come up and they lift and, round. And at the moment, I have two, and I cut them way back, and except fronds that look like they were actually producing something. And so there are these clumps and pots, and they're producing new fronds, but I'm not hopeful.
Yeah. As far as there's nothing in literature that suggests you have to be a maiden to plant them. But after the talk, let's try to troubleshoot that. Let's see.
I think we have time for
Yeah.
one more question here.
Thank you. I'm working in an area in Graham that has kind of old forest and kind of scrub and removing silt grass and other things. And I find a lot of rattlesnake ferns and some ebony spleenworts. I've tried planting a Christmas fern in that area. That doesn't do well. What does my findings say about the soil and what other things might work there? Thank you.
So it's moist enough for stilt grass, but not for. I think we might want to look at. Are you buying divisions or making your own divisions? Are you replanting them from moving them from the site, or are you purchasing them outright from retailers? I misunderstood. Sorry.
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding.
Are you taking a population that you find and subdividing it? And
I find a lot, there's quite a large population. I probably found 24 of the rattlesnake ferns and maybe 4 or 5 ebony spleenwort in an area that's not very big. And I planted the Christmas fern kind of over on an edge of that might get more sun. So.
How about, if both of you will talk to me afterwards. I have the Hoshizaki book with me. We'll see if there's some species-specific recommendations for those sorts of divisions.
Matt, thank you so much. This was really great. Botany to technology to just want to remind you all, we talked about local nurseries selling ferns. Well, we have a big plant sale coming up September 27th and 28th, and I confirmed with our Director of Horticulture, Dan Stern, we'll have a variety of ferns available there. So please look that up and come join us for that. And again, remember to enjoy the Sculpture in the Garden event this fall. Thank you all for being here. 10% off for everybody in the room and the garden shop today only, as well as for our Zoom folks. So enjoy. Thanks for being here. See you next time.